Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Supply Chain Challenges and Cannabis, a Global Outlook for 2022. My name is Eric Sandy, and I'm the digital editor of Cannabis Business Times. Each day lately, it seems, brings new challenges from the global supply chain. Homeowners know this, as well as pretty much anyone working in a competitive commercial landscape, cannabis, of course, included. What does that mean, supply chain challenges? We've assembled a panel from around the US marketplace to explain what they're seeing. This could include shipping delays, product shortages, tech problems, and more, and to discuss new solutions to this emerging and ongoing and fairly abstract issue in the business. At the end of the presentation, we're going to conclude with a Q&A, so keep your questions handy. Today's panelists, I'm very pleased to welcome, are Ryan Cook, Executive Vice President for Operations for Jushi, Jed McWhorter, Director of Purchasing for Curaleaf, and Graham Farrar, President of Glasshouse Brands. Before we get going with our panel discussion today, I just want to make a few quick notes. As you're filing into the webinar here and getting comfortable, check out the bottom of your screen. You'll notice a Q&A button. If you click that, it'll open the Q&A box. So please, as the conversation's going on and we're touching on different topics, please drop your questions in there and we'll make sure to get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Also, just know that we are recording today's presentation. So in the next few days here, you're going to receive a link via email to the whole presentation, the audio, the video, and the Q&A as well. Also, before we get going, I'd just like to point out that this is the type of conversation that we'll be having more of in Las Vegas later this year at Cannabis Conference 2022. That's going to be August 23rd to the 25th, again, out in Las Vegas. You can learn more at cannabisconference.com after the presentation. Also know that we are running our lowest registration rates of the season, about 60% off full registration. So if an hour from now, if you're very pleased with the type of discussion we're having and you like the content, please check out cannabisconference.com because we're going to keep it up over there. Now, I would like to get the conversation started with Ryan Cook. As I said, Ryan, and to the whole full panel, we're dealing with fairly broad topics, kind of abstract topics too in some ways. Could you maybe define supply chain or supply chain challenges and sort of what comes to mind from your perspective at Jushi lately?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for having me. Jushi really appreciates this. And but yeah, from a supply chain standpoint, I mean, I think as you're identifying maybe more liberally, the supply chain can be defined as management and coordination of both products and services, both from the manufacturing and then the delivery of cannabis products to our patients and our customers nationally. And so, I think that for us, I mean, I think some of the challenges that we've been, experiencing more traditionally is more on the construction side. I think Jushi's, growth model right now requires us to be purchasing, construction materials on a large scale. I think that has, forced our construction teams as well as our operating teams to really think, strategically about how to purchase those items. Whether that might be in volume, in advance and shipping those products out later, or sometimes purchasing those from multiple sources and being able to, really kind of stay on budget and on timeline. I mean, I think, that's the biggest thing for our shareholders is making sure that, that we have the ability to move at the pace that we had identified. And so, primarily that's one of our biggest issues. I think for the most part, I think we've been able to, as an organization, perform very well on ensuring that the products are getting to our patients. So more so just, like I said, at scale, on the construction side.
Absolutely, yeah, and certainly a couple threads that we'll be pulling at as the conversation gets going. To continue setting the stage, Jed, could you maybe elaborate from Curaleaf's perspective and talk about any supply chain related issues you've been noticing over certainly the last year and a half or 2 years?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I think Ryan hit the nail on the head when he talked about construction. All of the facility modifications that we're doing are taking longer, and the inflationary climate that we're currently living through certainly doesn't help that either. But being a vertically integrated supplier in most of our states, we're seeing it a bit across the board. Material lead times, equipment lead times, increased freight costs, having to move materials from one place to another, which we wouldn't normally have to do. Changes in specifications due to particular shortages on particular items. So, if something runs out, we have to change the spec. It's all across the board.
Yeah, no doubt. Definitely a wide-ranging spectrum, and we'll be digging in with a bit of specificity momentarily. But Graham, I wanted to turn to you. Of course, you're there in the Santa Barbara area. I'm tempted to bring up your proximity to the Port of Los Angeles. Maybe that's in the background here, but maybe if you could elaborate on some of these issues too, from your perspective / the California view as well.
Yeah, sure. And so, first of all, thanks for having us from Glass House. For those who don't know, Glass House is one of the largest operators in California. We're fully vertically integrated. We currently operate about 500,000 square feet of functional, licensed greenhouses, a picture of which is behind me. We've got 4 stores here. The pharmacy is the chain of brands, and 4 more stores currently under development. We also have Glass House Farms and a number of other brands. Glass House Farms is, at least per BDS, the #1 flower brand in the state of California. Obviously, California is the largest cannabis market in the planet, and the flower category is the largest category within that market. And I say that because we're across the spectrum, right? We're doing everything from a $30 million retrofit at a $5.5 million square foot farm that we just acquired, to building out new stores, to operating a brand at scale. And so I think it's important when you're thinking supply chain to kind of break it into a couple categories, right? One is the construction and retrofit materials category. The other is the operational category, supplies. I mean, things like fertilizer right now is basically doubled in price, right? I mean, you can read in the Wall Street Journal about it. They're thinking grain, I'm thinking cannabis, right? And then from there, I think it's worth breaking into kind of 2 different aspects of supply chain. One is the inflationary side that Jed mentioned, right? Pricing and what things cost. The other is just pure availability and how long it takes to get things. So, fertilizer, as an example, is double the price that it used to be, and it takes longer to get. We're doing a lot. We have a 5.5 million square foot greenhouse in Camarillo that we acquired about 4 months ago, and we're about 80% of the way through a $30 million phase 1 retrofit on that. Lots of stuff coming over from Holland. It's absolutely insane how much pricing has gone up on freight. I mean, shipping containers that used to be $1,000 and take 4 or 5 weeks are now $20,000 and take 8 weeks if you're lucky. So, on that side, it's a lot of lead times, it's a lot of shipping prices, and then you get double compounded because a lot of the materials are more expensive as well. So we've been taking some pretty unique approaches. You mentioned the Port of Los Angeles, one of the most congested places out there right now. So one of the things that we've been doing is, rather than renting containers, they call it demurrage, and then bringing into normal ports, we're actually buying containers and shipping them to non-standard ports, or even shipping them to the East Coast and trucking them across the states. Once we get our materials, then we sell the containers. So it's an incredible amount of hoops that we've been jumping through. On the operational side, we're basically treating everything like we're always out of it, right? Meaning that if there's an opportunity to get it, if you see a price, it doesn't matter how much we have, because we're not sure when the next time we can get it again is. So a lot of work going into that. Our purchasing departments are being real heroes right now, and doing lots of overtime to make sure that they're both getting stuff as inexpensively as possible and as quickly as possible. And I'd venture to say, in the last 10 years, this is probably about as hard as it has been on both of those fronts.
No doubt. And I want to circle back to, I think it's a good, helpful framing device, the inflationary side of things, the product availability side of things. We're going to be moving back and forth between those 2 poles as this conversation gets going. Jed, we've already begun talking a bit about geography a little bit, but I wanted to get a sense from you about, I guess what I might say is state to state variability. As an MSO, how might an MSO need to sort of rethink some of these availability issues, at least from state to state? Graham was just talking about California. Each state has its own regulatory identity, and certainly plenty of crossover as well. But is there a lot of does this issue change much across state borders, I guess is the question.
I think there's a definite challenge in balancing trying to bring new products to market in new states and not paying a premium to rush things and to overstock your items. So, as Curaleaf, we operate in 23 states. We're trying to build national brands in those states. We have to balance, how quickly do we bring this product in? What kind of things do we rush in? How long are our carrying costs for certain items as we're doing them? With, how quickly do we want to get our products into these new markets, and how quickly do we want to service our customers and patients in those markets? I think every state has its own challenges, but as a whole, we want to balance, how we're operating our supply chain efficiently so that we're not overstocked on items or paying to rush items in while trying to launch those brands.
Yeah. And I think, that I feel like lead times is something we're sort of talking about a lot here. And I'm going to dig into that momentarily, but I did want to touch real quick on maybe one last thing that to me is sort of lumped under the supply chain issue, which is labor supply and just the workforce. Ryan, just given Jushi's ongoing expansion, what are you seeing on that side of things, whether it's hiring trends or even retention trends? We've been reporting on, I guess you sort of throw some quotation marks around this phrase, the great resignation. I mean, this is something that all industries are kind of dealing with. What sort of macro labor outlook are you seeing in cannabis?
Well, I mean, obviously we're seeing it. I mean, I think that it's exciting, the fact that, cannabis still has an allure to it that I think we're tracking from other industries. So as that reshuffling is taking place, I think traditionally we're benefiting right now from majority of those individuals wanting to come, and see, essentially what the cannabis industry is all about. And so I think some very talented individuals we've had an opportunity to pick up through this process and in quite a few different divisions of the organization. So I think, for us, it's been good. Of course, there's been some turnover. I think some of that turnover is of course healthy, as I just identified. I think some additional industries, pharmaceutical, alcohol, we're seeing a lot of executive individuals and those just interested in cannabis in general that want to make that transition. So I think for us, so far it's been pretty good. But I think we'll see how things continue as the company continues to grow. But yeah, pretty positive.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt to be in a rapidly growing industry for sure these days.
If you guys didn't see it, everyone should check out Leafsley's report on cannabis and jobs that came out last week. That basically put cannabis as one of the fastest growing sectors in the United States, which is mind-blowing considering that it's still federally illegal and prohibitions exist in more places than not. I mean, it really shows the power of what this industry could be, both for job creation as well as tax revenue, never mind the healing and the social justice side of things. But it's a real, if you look back in history, the end of prohibition helped pull our country out of the Great Depression. So the end of cannabis prohibition could have a similarly catalytic force to help improve our economy and the business climate in general.
I think as well, the cannabis industry is attracting a labor force that's unlike any other. I've never met as many people who are as deeply passionate about what they do, or as many people who are willing to drop what they're doing just to help you when you need it. So I think it's a great thing for this industry.
The whole entire industry is built on compassion and helping, and it shows.
Absolutely. It really is a great report too. I mean, they dig in really well, especially regionally. Just as a quick number here, they were reporting 428,000 jobs in the industry, across the U.S. That's a 33% jump from 2020. These are 2021 numbers, of course. So certainly something that is a helpful backdrop here. One thing that is sort of baked into a lot of these questions and answers, Graham, is long-term planning. And it's already sort of a Pandora's box maybe in the cannabis space because the industry is moving so fast, and it's interesting just trying to look out 3, 4, 5 years in the future. But when we're talking about some of these lead times, the availability issues, and certainly the expansions and plans that you're mentioning from Glasshouse, how should long-term planning be rethought or re-strategized? I know that's kind of a broad question.
That's a good question. I mean, so I think the definition of long-term in cannabis is maybe different than the definition of long. Running half joke is every day is Monday and every week's a year in the cannabis industry. So 5-year planning I don't think is intersects with the supply chain much right now. I think supply chain, 5 years from now will be very different. But I do think that it's certainly on, like, let's call it the next 12 to 24 months window is something that people need to be thinking about, right? I mean, one of the things that we're struggling with a lot right now or working on solving is knowing it's the interaction and the intermingling of all these different things, right? Like, okay, you want to launch a new product, but how long does it take to get the packaging from China, right? You want to retrofit a greenhouse. How long does it take to get the thing, the equipment from Holland? And does it make sense to air freight it because you don't know if the steel that's coming from China is going to beat it? Where's the long pole, basically, right? And so there's a lot of that going on, which is you're trying to get things as done as quickly, but also as efficiently as possible. But everything's in pretty rapid flux, and it's far less predictable than it has historically been, right? Shipping times, lead times, availability. I mean, you got things, everything from the cost of freight to the semiconductor crisis, right? So you may have the machine in Holland, but they can't get the little chips for the PLC to make the thing run. And so now you're talking about, how does that interface with how much money you should spend to ship in the building that it's going in or whatever, right? And I think that is really where the long range planning struggle is right now, is just, getting those things to line up on a calendar. And I think anybody doing construction right now probably needs to take whatever their schedule was, double it like you should always do, but then probably double it again, because by the time you have all these, interminglings of various different delays, it really is a challenge. I think our team I give them a lot of kudos because they've got a big project and they're more or less staying on schedule and on budget, which is a real testament to their ability and hard work. But that's a tough thing to do right now.
Yeah, I think our 2 to 5 year planning is more strategically around footprint and expansion programming. I think you have to build in a healthy level of versatility into the programming. The reality is that we're changing processes on a regular basis. New equipment's coming out, very regularly. So those are more difficult to get your arms around in comparison to sort of where we see ourselves on a national footprint or even international footprint standpoint.
One thing I would say though is I don't think there's any industry better set up to deal with this kind of challenge, right? I mean, cannabis is an industry. If you got to be gritty, you got to be flexible, you got to be determined. Like, if you're not those things, you're in the wrong spot. And those are the same skills and traits that help you deal with stuff like this. I mean, we've been, whether it was lack of banking, whether it's a federal illegality, whether it's the fact that nothing is easy, because as soon as you say cannabis, everyone says, oh, I don't know, I'll have to check if we can insure you. I'll have to check if we can run your payroll or whatever, right? Like, that's the stuff we've been dealing with for 25 years. So this just happens to be the latest blip. We live in an industry that's unpredictable. We're writing the future. We're building it as we go. This is just another layer that gets thrown on top. So I think we got a great group of people in a great industry to be able to handle these challenges that are getting thrown at us.
Yeah, and all of these issues go back to the people around us that are entrepreneurial and agile. Those are the two things that you really need to have to succeed in this industry. Where you allocate your resources and looking at the long-term plan is a little bit secondary to the people who are executing it. And we have great people.
Yeah, I think that's a key backdrop to this. It really, cannabis in so many ways has an opportunity to, push us to rethink the way we do business in a lot of different ways, and certainly here dealing with global implications. I wanted to pitch a few questions around to the three of you here. One of which just being maybe equipment or machinery related. We've mentioned this a few times. Graham, you mentioned the semiconductor crisis, which I think is a really important thing to get into. I was talking to a executive in Connecticut who was describing challenges with literally the computer parts of HVAC equipment, heating and cooling, and how just those little components were setting back some expansion plans. Do any of you have specific equipment that you'd like to sort of zoom in on that's been either significantly delayed or has been a problem area? This could also be literally a material that is used in a lot of equipment. So I don't know if any of you would like to zoom in on a particular material or piece of equipment in your grow that has been a problem area over the last year that maybe other growers in the audience might have been running into as well.
I mentioned it already, but I think fertilizer is one to watch right now. We're certainly seeing price climbs and availability hiccups. We've been managing it pretty well just because we typically carry large stockpiles, but you occasionally have to, it's certainly something I would not try and run a just-in-time model on something that is critical to your operation like fertilizer. You should definitely want to have, weeks to months of supply on that. The other thing, I guess, on the local front is labor. California just raised the minimum wage again. We're, building out a 5.5 million square foot farm, so squarely in the ag front with hundreds and hundreds of workers set up for that. So, any changes in the labor markets, I think, are something you need to keep an eye on. Inflation hits not just the businesses, but the people as well, and so that'll ripple through to wages eventually. One of the nice things about cannabis, though, I do think is, well, we shouldn't be protectionist between states. I think it's probably unconstitutional. We're very comfortable being protectionist between countries. And so a lot of the lower labor rates that exist and lower regulatory structures that exist in other countries were probably somewhat insulated from in cannabis for a while here. So that should help, give the industry a chance to get its feet under it from that point of view.
Eric, I mentioned earlier steel. Of course, that's a big challenge, and steel being, a component of quite a few different products that we're putting in our facilities these days. And so, from racking systems to wall paneling systems, framing materials, all of those are of course challenged a bit. We've also been, some more specific items, from some of the trimming equipment or processing equipment that we're utilizing, and I think the ways around that are of course working with our suppliers to purchase in bulk. I think the bulk purchasing has allowed us to warehouse some of those items and move them to new acquisitions that we're doing fairly regularly. And so again, it's just the procurement division just really needs to strategize how they're pulling this off. I think Graham mentioned it earlier, but my hat goes off to that team on a regular basis internally, that they're able to manage some of these things as effectively as they are. We've been looking at antimicrobial coatings on the interior of ductwork. Our ductwork, there's now down to essentially one facility that's ultimately capable of doing that. And so there's a bit of a bottleneck for a lot of us to figure out. I think all of us understand that we're all competing for some of the same equipment out there. And so how do we strategize against one another to be able to pull that off?
Yeah, I think Graham touched on it before about things like PLC boards and equipment like that. We have equipment that we've shipped from our manufacturers that are only waiting on that one component to be installed. So, you're taking it off the boat and it's shy one piece to make it operational. But the issues persist amongst everything. You're talking about very mature supply chains that have been established for 30 plus years that are seeing strains like they've never seen before. And it's really, up and down. You mentioned the fertilizer. I can think about plastics. Plastics are extremely tight. The markets are very high. The lead times are getting longer. And then, like you guys said, the equipment it's crazy.
Yeah, one example on that. So you can actually see it in my background here. We put a new roof on one of our facilities, and it was normally you would have got it probably, I'd say, 4 weeks. Materials were out 6 months, and the reason I figured out was because it was during COVID, and all the Lexan shields that you saw when you walked into every store. That's where all the plastic was going. So we couldn't get the plastics for our roofs because everyone was putting up the shields at the bank tellers and things like that. So, there's just so many. Now you got the conflict in Ukraine, you've got the restarting from COVID, you've got inflation, right? And it's like, those things, the confluence of those events is very hard to predict.
Absolutely. I know we've just we've got a question here in the chat, and I'll just remind everybody too of just the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to add questions down there, but I'm going to jump to this one real quick. Someone in the audience was asking Graham to, and really the whole panel, to expand this discussion around the labor force. We've talked about some California issues, general issues facing other industries, and sort of this ongoing Great Resignation issue. What are some of the, skill sets, or what sense of competition are you seeing among those skill sets that cannabis is trying to bring in right now. We've talked about executive level employees and certainly all the way down. Where is the greatest need or the greatest gap for cannabis?
Yeah. It's a good question. So again, since we're vertically integrated, I have to put things into categories, right? So on the farm side, we've been very intentional about making sure that our operations are located in kind of traditional ag areas because that labor pool is so important. So Santa Barbara County is where our two existing farms are. That's a big ag spot. Ventura County is where our new supersized farm is. So there's lots of agricultural labor. You look in every direction and you see green fields of things growing. So from that point of view, the labor hasn't been a real challenge for us. I think cannabis, maybe it was Ryan who mentioned, it has a bit of an appeal. It's new, there's an allure, there's an opportunity for somebody to be the best at something because it is new, and so they can come in and get an early jump on it. You also do see a little bit of the converse though, particularly with people who are working on green cards and things like that, concerned with immigration status. They actually have the opposite, which is they get nervous about cannabis because of the federal illegality, and it's concerned that if they go back home to Holland or something, that when they come back, the customs guy will say, "Where do you work?" And they say Glass House, and he Googles it and says, "Sorry, you can't come in," right? So you have kind of both sides on that at the farms, but more, I think it's excitement. Cannabis does tend to pay a little bit of a premium over traditional ag, and I think, at least we intentionally, but I think cannabis in general, treat people a bit less like a tool in the shed and more like a member of the team. So we're intentional about having internal people that we train and give career paths for, which is different sometimes in the seasonal field work. So there's definitely a demographic out there that really appreciates that. On the retail side is maybe where there's a bit more challenge. I think I'm going to try and not make myself sound old, but there's a little bit more of an entitlement factor going on there, an expectation for higher wages. And, there's demographics very excited about cannabis and they love it and they're awesome. And when you find those people, you hold on to them forever. But then there's also I'm just looking for a job and, this doesn't pay enough and I don't show up on time and I call out, with no warning. And I think that's a little bit, that's due to the labor shortage and kind of your great resignation thing, which is that there's a lot of options out there and people, seem to kind of question whether or not they want to work. On the corporate side, I think I would say the labor pool is expanding. And the reason for that is the stigma is going down and people who wouldn't have considered cannabis before, be it a CFO or a CMO, are now actually, again, for some of the same reasons you see at the farm, excited about it because, you can be a CMO that's good and you can be a CMO that's good in cannabis and be the best cannabis CMO, right? It's a smaller pool. And I think that, smart folks out there are recognizing where this is going and latching onto the opportunity to have a head start on the rest of their, core cohort of peers by doing something in cannabis. So I think there the level seems to be rising.
Yeah, and Jed and Ryan, I know we had talked about labor issues earlier, but just sort of going off that question, are there certain skill sets that maybe have emerged over the last year or so that your company is either privileging or targeting even more so in this climate?
So, yeah, I mean, we're searching for skill sets, of well-rounded people. One of the things that we're really pushing hard for is a diverse workforce. Equity and inclusion is incredibly important to Curaleaf and certainly to try to help with, help with the atrocities of the past in the cannabis industry, right? So, we're trying to bring in a workforce that is diverse and entrepreneurial and intelligent and passionate and all of these things. I think there's a lot of different jobs that you can do in this industry. And certainly for a company like ours, we have all sorts of jobs that require different skill sets. It's more about, are you the right fit and can you bring your skills to that particular job?
Interesting thing that we're dealing with too is that, at this point, cannabis, this isn't not a work from home position. right? In our grower processor facilities throughout the country, I think that's the one thing that, of course, has been attracting a lot of individuals from the workforce is to be able to take up positions that are like that. And as we've talked about today, I mean, the passion of individuals in the cannabis industry, we hope is the catalyst for them to be able to, continue to come into these facilities and recognize that it's exciting to be able to work with the plant, around the plant, to be in a dispensary and work with patients and customers and talk to them about the cannabis plant. And so, that it's a little bit different than I think some of these other industries that are out there right now.
Certainly. I know we talked a bit about sort of that MSO perspective and some state by state variability. I wanted to maybe just touch on that one more time. And I don't want to get too far afield of the topic at hand, but I think this falls under the umbrella. About a year ago, of course, there was a significant winter storm that, sort of walloped North America, but certainly walloped Texas. And I know at least one story that emerged from that was there are companies in that area of Texas that are the source of a lot of adhesive chemicals for product labels and all sorts of labels, really. So the adhesive supply was really, I'm oversimplifying here, but it was thrown into dire straits for a while. So what I want to ask is, are there any sort of hyper-local supply chain issues in the US that might be worth flagging, whether we're talking about California coast, as we have been, or New England, or the Midwest? This kind of opens the door to that natural disaster conversation that I think does play a role here. So again, we're talking kind of globally, we're talking about a lot of commodities, but are there more hyper-local US regions that might be worth flagging for conversation here?
So I think that, it's not necessarily, at least in my eyes, it's not necessarily one region that has a hyper-local issue. We're operating facilities in multiple states. Every one of those facilities needs an electrician, a plumber, a maintenance person, whatever that may be. And they're facing the supply chain shortages the same way the rest of us are. And so if a component to a machine that needs to be fixed, or if a generator that, needs to come in is 2-3 weeks late, those businesses are delayed as well. And you want to talk about hyper local, you don't get much more so than your local electrician who's coming in to fix your generator.
Yeah, I don't really think of too much on the hyper local side either. But it's more that interplay between all the things, right? So like we were having a challenge to getting enough buffered cocoa for one of our farms. And the reason was because they couldn't get the calcium nitrate, which they used to buffer it. So the only cocoa they had available, this is, Sri Lanka talking to China, coming to California, right? Like it's those pieces where one, you're only as strong as the weakest link, and one link breaks and the whole thing stops, or the menu changes, so to speak. And so, then we had to source that so we could get the cocoa and we could buffer it ourselves. Again, you're already busy, everyone's running fast, cannabis is a challenge, and then you get, these kind of hand grenades lobbed in there that you have to deal with, right? And so it's a lot more of that, I think, than any particular region that has a issue and then that stops all of something happening. It's really the interplay on a global basis that makes the challenge right now.
Yeah, the challenges probably, as just noted, are generally in our court. It's wonderful to know that I think our patients and customers are still receiving the same products and services that they've been used to.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I've got two sort of overarching questions here. I'm going to start sort of swerving over to the audience Q&A momentarily, but I have two again, broad sort of questions here. We've talked about a lot of your own perspectives on the supply chain question, and a lot has changed certainly over the last year or so. It's a complicated topic though. So from your perspectives, what are people getting wrong? Now, these could be other folks in the industry, folks in the market, even competitors, or people who are just sort of on the sidelines, maybe considering getting in. What are we missing so far? What's being misconstrued maybe in the more mainstream media?
I think we're still undercounting inflation right now. I wouldn't necessarily say I think it's going to be super long term, but I don't think it's done yet. And so, I think that's going to have ripple effects throughout the entire supply chain, which then, pass on to the businesses, which end up with the consumer, which kind of, reinforces the cycle. So I don't know how long it's going to last, but I don't think we're done yet. Most everything we're seeing is still going up in price right now. I'm not sure that's been fully embraced yet.
I think the one of the things that I'm seeing that I think people are getting wrong is assuming that you have to go overseas in order to fulfill your materials. The best suppliers that I'm working with are investing heavily in equipment and capabilities in order to do things domestically. And they may not be able to match the exact price point that you could get if you go internationally, but the lead times could be 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks shorter than what you're waiting. So what's the cost of delay, right? I think that the assumption is that in order to make margins and to be cheap, you have to do it internationally. And I'm not so sure that's going to be true in a few years.
Yeah, it'd be great to see a little more onshoring would be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ryan, anything from your perspective as far as things that might be overlooked or misconstrued?
I think possibly demand. I think we're still looking in a lot of different markets of whether we're understanding that oversupply or undersupply is sort of where that particular market stands. We still have quite a few markets that are changing, moving from medical to recreational. So there's still some opportunity and excitement out there, and I think that sometimes we see some of our competitors either missing the mark there or not pushing hard enough based on what I think is coming.
Yeah. One last big broad question, and we'll get into some audience Q&A. I wanted to ask each of you what sort of advice you might give to a driven entrepreneur interested in getting into the space in 2022. And I'll quickly just add that I've asked other folks this question from around the US market, and at times when I ask it, people have gasped. I think it's a tough question, and what I mean by that is it's a tough time right now. So I'm curious what advice you might have for those folks and how that advice may have differed from the same question and answer maybe 2 years ago. I guess the question is sort of how some of the supply chain pressures and the evolution of cannabis have changed the advice you might give to someone who is, a great upstart and entrepreneur interested in getting into the space, maybe in one of the newer markets. What might you tell them?
I think I would. Oh, good.
Go ahead, Jeremy. You're right.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think with any entrepreneurial activity, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So you have to start off with a mindset that no matter what the challenges are, you're going to make it happen. The supply chain is just the latest, flavor of the day of the challenges that you're going to have to overcome. But more broadly, I think that the excitement and path of cannabis has never been more clear, right? Every day that goes by, there's more people enjoying and benefiting from cannabis than the day before. There's more today, and there'll be even more tomorrow, right? The stream of headlines, they may not be as fast as we want, particularly on the federal level, but the stream of headlines is constant. It is one state after another. We're setting sales records. California did $5.2 billion in cannabis sales legally last year, right? That's probably a third of the market, maybe even a quarter, right? So you're talking more like $15, $20 billion of cannabis sales in one single state, right? Illinois is setting records. Like everywhere you look, this market is getting more and more exciting, and it's more and more clear that it's not a passing fad. People aren't going to move on to something else. It is the new thing, whether it comes from enjoyment, whether it comes from medicine, whether it comes from self-care, right? Like it has so much potential, and the walls and the stigma are falling down so quickly that loving cannabis isn't enough. But if you love cannabis and if you have a skill set, pick a skill, pick where the intersection of loving cannabis and loving technology or marketing or sales or whatever the thing is, and dive into it. Because if you start now, you're going to be so far ahead of so many people that you're going to have the real opportunity to not just be good, but to be amazing, because you're going to be good in cannabis and not many others will be. So I would highly encourage somebody to do it. It's not easy. No one says it will be. Building something great and valuable never is. And there's certainly no promise or expectation that it should be. But the opportunities over the next 10 to 20 years for cannabis are off the charts.
So I was just going to say that, I think all of us on this call, at a certain point in time, of course, made a leap, right? That we jumped into cannabis. And I know that there are so many others out there as you just noted, entrepreneurs that are thinking about getting in, and how exactly would we advise them? I think, I've had that same question for years and years, being in the cannabis industry as long as I have. And I can remember back then, I would answer it the same way as I would now. As this industry continues to bring on new and exciting positions and expands into what is a more traditional commercial industry, do what you do. That there's no need to step too far out of your comfort range. I think that the industry now, from entry level positions to laboratory positions, and many years in with science or agricultural backgrounds, it's still an exciting opportunity for them to be able to join, and in those particular categories. You don't have to, contrary to popular belief, you do not have to just be a grower. You do not have to, those are not necessarily the only steps. And so, hopefully we'll be able to continue to attract those types of individuals.
Yeah, so I would say, my piece of advice would be don't get trapped into operating like mature industries operate. I think that the amount of the people who've come to the cannabis industry flock here creatively, and you should use that to maintain your agility. And, as it pertains to this conversation, when you do have an issue or a supply chain issue or a material issue, whatever it may be, the people who come to work in this industry are full of solutions. And use them. You use those solutions, make your pivot, and don't you think just, oh, I don't have this material, I can't complete today's operation. Somebody on your staff has an idea.
I think maybe one other thing too that I would encourage somebody is two things really. One is maintain the compassion, right? That's how this industry came. And so anybody coming in should keep in mind that is the goal. The goal is to help people feel better, be happier with plants. And the other is to recognize, the social justice conundrum that we're in, right? We're coming out of, hopefully, a war on drugs that was, bullshit, right? It was never really a war on drugs. It was war on people, and specific people at that. And now we're making this transition where, the people on this phone call and lots of others in the industry are talking about supply chain. Well, there's people sitting, there's 2,700 federal prisoners sitting in jail for nonviolent cannabis crimes. There's probably 40,000 people sitting in jails across the country for nonviolent cannabis crimes. And I think it's incumbent upon this industry to connect the flywheel of the success that we're trying to build to helping fix the right some of the wrongs of the past there. And so as you come into this industry, recognize that you're taking its responsibility. And it's also, it's an honor to be able to help fight to fix some of those things. So I hope people come into this industry maintain those two things as they do everything else that they do.
Well said.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sort of on that note, I wanted to ask, of course, we're talking, we've talked about sort of multi-state themes and of course, the global supply chain, as broad of a topic as that is. I was wondering if maybe you could touch on just the balance between larger companies in the space and smaller companies. A lot of what we're talking about here is universal. At a certain point, you've got to procure equipment, and you've got to, there's costs and expenses that go into the business. What sort of advice might you have for those smaller companies that might be either a one-off single license holder in a certain state, or whether it could be retail as well? What might not be translating from the larger viewpoint that might be worth honing in on real quick?
It's strategy and creativity. And this is no different for us than it is for smaller companies competing with an MSO. I'm competing against Amazon and Tesla for steel purchases and products on the construction side. And so all of us have to be extremely creative as to how we're putting those challenges to bed, right? And as I think I mentioned at the very beginning of this, whether that's us purchasing from multiple suppliers at the same time to acquire, what we're looking for, or continuing to negotiate, or as I think it was brought up earlier as well, Jed had said, potentially looking at manipulating certain materials that you're utilizing to be able to, move that project along. So, I think for the smaller operators, you have to do the exact same. I think, purchasing power may not be exactly the same, but being able to be creative and creating those types of relationships to ensure that when supply shortages happen, that those suppliers are thinking of you.
Yeah,
I think that's good advice. I think being this is a place where size probably does have some advantages. So I think you make up for size with nimbleness and creativity. And so figuring out ways to you got to keep your eyes on your end goal and figure out the means justify the ends to get there, kind of thing, right? So I'll use our cocoa example again. We couldn't get the buffered cocoa that we wanted, so we figured out why it wasn't available, and we were able to source the component that they were missing and buffer it ourselves, right? That's a specific tangible example, but there's going to be a lot of things in that theme that you're just going to have to figure out, right? And it's really, again, I think the cannabis industry and the people in it are set up for that, because flexible and gritty is what we do, but it's going to be a new layer of figuring out, how can I reuse this component? How can I repurpose this? How can I find the two pieces and assemble them myself, to make up for it? So a lot of that kind of creative problem solving is going to be required.
Yeah, and I think from the smaller companies' perspectives, as an MSO, we're heavily driven on wholesale. We're trying to sell our branded products everywhere. The smaller companies out there are our customers, and they are driven by quality and variety. I think if you keep those two things at the forefront, the consumer base will be there.
absolutely. Jed, we do have a question here relating to something I don't want to overlook, and that's just the hemp side. Not even the hemp side, but just the hemp industry, which in many ways behaves very differently than the state licensed THC rich cannabis space. So realizing that's almost a portal to a whole other webinar, could you maybe touch on just hemp and maybe some notable differences in these questions?
Sure. So along the hemp side, having centralized manufacturing that can go across state lines, it can certainly be beneficial. Having scale is usually beneficial. The challenge, I think, in the hemp side from the cannabis industry viewpoint is that traditional retail is a lot more tricky than running through the dispensary system that we have set up. It's less forgiving. Dispensaries, you can do what you need to do to market your product, but regarding the supply chain around centrally manufactured hemp items, if you have something that's not labeled correctly, or you have something that doesn't meet specification, you're not going to be able to send it through those mainstream retailers. So it can be a bit of a challenge. However, producing at scale is very nice.
Sure. We have a question here relating to something that we haven't really touched on too much, and that's automation, or certain software, or even just generally leveraging technology to guide some of these decisions. This could play into the labor questions that we had earlier, or even just procurement in general. So are there examples of emerging technologies or even automated technologies that may have become more important over the last year or so in different ways for you?
Yeah, so we do quite a bit of automation. I think automation is an interesting one though, because it can cut both ways, right? So we automate quite a bit, but as we're talking about, if something breaks and your automation is relying on it, and then you can't get that part because of supply chain issues, you've got a whole compounded set of issues to deal with. So you need to keep that in mind. You need to keep, your spares supply in mind. You need to have your backup plans in mind. But on the other end of the spectrum, with labor rates going up and things being more expensive, then automation can be a great way to reduce costs. We're also doing a good bit on the software side. We use ERP and Microsoft Business Central so that we can track a lot of the things, which makes purchasing more efficient, because weeks to cover and things like that. So if you want to say, I want to go from 4 weeks to cover to 8 weeks to cover because of supply chain issues, you adjust setting basically, and you can start getting help on that, so you don't get caught off guard. So that can be helpful. The other thing is we use a lot of labor tracking that feeds back into our ERP so that we can really optimize the teams and the people and who's doing what and plan for things better and be more efficient, which at the end of the day, the goal is to, for us to grow the highest quality cannabis at the lowest possible price. And that means being efficient with all the things that we do. And software is a great help for that.
I think that the software has given us a lot of opportunity, Jushi, as a data-driven organization. I think it's critical that we're able to utilize that information to further advance our programming within the organization, so that we are being more efficient and that we are not wasting. Of course, automation equipment is always going to come into play, but I think the exciting thing for us is that allows us an expansion opportunity that right now, while we are talking about staffing and challenges that happen there, it's never to reduce our workforce. I think our workforces need to continue to expand, pretty substantially beyond where they are today. But we're giving, individuals a really exciting opportunity to learn about new technologies that are now being purpose-built for the cannabis industry. Similarly to the way that we've watched machinists, take over after Industrial Revolution, and saw incredible skill sets being, given to certain individuals. And this is, I think, the same thing. I mean, we're on the beginning here of seeing what type of automation equipment and technology in general is coming into the cannabis industry. But it has been right now, I think for us, has been, really focused on collecting all of that data and utilizing it rather than sitting on it, as I think a lot of individuals probably do.
Yeah, I think Ryan's right, dead on that point in terms of collecting the data and making sure that you're making data-driven decisions. It feels like every day, you walk into the office and somebody brings the next new great machine and puts it in front of you. We've all seen a lot of them. Some of them have benefit, and some of them, will break down in a week. I think that as long as you're using your data to drive your decisions and you're planning appropriately, and back to what Graham said, you're putting your policies and your spares and your PM maintenances in place before you go cut the big check, then automation can be a great thing.
Absolutely. We've got an interesting question here, and the audience member starts off by writing that the FTC reported that consumers lost $5.8 billion to fraud last year. So on top of that, this person's basically asking, is the cannabis industry having any scam issues or counterfeiting or anything like that? This isn't something that came up earlier, but there may be some crossover here. I'm wondering if there are certain things to watch out for.
There's definitely counterfeiting on the product side. I'm not aware of any cannabis specific scams. I mean, I know it does feel like we get targeted with phishing attacks and things like that, people trying to get employees to buy gift cards, but I don't imagine that that's truly cannabis specific. On the product side, though, you definitely see counterfeiting. I mean, there's a street in LA where you could drive down the street and buy knockoff packaging for Glass House and Field and cookies and et cetera, et cetera. You're starting to see the photos come out of New York and a lot of the unlicensed shops that are opening up there. I imagine it's a mix of actual product that's smuggled versus counterfeit packaging that's filled with something else. But that's certainly a thing. So you definitely want to keep an eye on that and look for the variable print batch labels. California brands are probably the most frequently counterfeited. So look for more than just the California cannabis triangle, but look for the variable print batches and things like that. They're less likely to be on counterfeit products. Some things are using holograms and tamper evident seals and things like that. So keep your eye on those as a way to reduce the chance of getting hit by scam products.
Yeah, and please buy your cannabis products from reputable sources.
Yeah. I mean, in California, actually, case in point, there's so many unlicensed shops that the DCC, as the Department of Cannabis Control, actually gave us a poster to put up that has a QR code, so that a consumer coming in not only just sees a license, but actually a license that ties back to the state system, so you can verify that you're really standing at the right license and the right address. So I think you can be safe. Nothing in a licensed cannabis dispensary will be a counterfeit product. The track and trace systems wouldn't allow it to happen. But if you're in an unlicensed store, odds are probably, better than 50-50 that you are looking at a counterfeit or unlicensed product.
I mean, and maybe just as a segue from the DCC, and this could certainly relate to any state really, but we do have a question relating to any delays on the regulatory side that may relate to delays in becoming operational or expanding.
Always.
Footprint.
Yeah, I was going to say, the real question is ever not delays, right? So
well, these agencies are dealing with the same things that all of us have been dealing with. I mean, closures of their departments and COVID causing problems and challenging them. And so, there's been a lot of, sort of video inspections or walkthroughs or interviews and conversations like that. I feel like probably throughout the country, similarly to the way that most businesses are opening back up, I think a lot of those agencies are starting to see, increased number of inspectors and giving them greater opportunity to be out in the field and walking through our facilities.
Yeah, well, and resources compared to expansion as well, right? This industry is growing like crazy. Every state that has turned legal is year over year opening more stores, more facilities. I don't know that the regulatory agencies are growing at the same rate.
Yeah, and I think they are. They're struggling. For those of us that care about moving unlicensed to licensed too, it's a good thing to see them doing the work and getting back out there. I mean, Oregon was a good example. Through COVID, they basically said they weren't going to do inspections of the hemp operators. Well, turns out of the people who were compliant enough to go get a hemp license, when they actually tested what they were growing, 55% of them were growing cannabis, right? That cannabis wasn't staying in Oregon. Oklahoma, I think, got out of hand a bit as well. Now that the regulators are back out there, they're finding out that a lot of the folks who are growing aren't actually licensed. And so, I think as that kind of catches back up, there's a supply chain of regulators too, so to speak. And hopefully that's going to ease the tensions here in the next 12 months or so as well.
Yeah, certainly both two very interesting narratives there. We have a question here just relating to insurance procurement. And it's, again, another thing we haven't really talked about in this hour, but are there any challenges to that may not have existed 2 years ago, whether we're talking about crops and products themselves or property? This is always an interesting area in cannabis anyway, but any emerging challenges on the insurance procurement side?
I've always found insurance to actually be one of the more progressive of the industries. They were far ahead of banking. Insurance for us has always been one of the easier things.
Yeah, I think we're able to be insured as well. If anything, it's going the other direction where things are getting easier. 4 years ago, I couldn't get a lease on a copy machine.
Yeah, I think we've experienced similar situations there with insurance.
Awesome. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on product packaging. I know we were just talking about this a moment ago relating to some of the counterfeits out there, but in terms of the packaging materials, some of this falls under the regulatory side of things. But in terms of the materials or anything that goes into the packaging side of things, are there changes that your company has gone through with respect to packaging that might alleviate certain product shortages or rising costs?
Yeah, we try to make our packaging so that it is compliant in all of the markets that we're operating in, but also that it's a good user experience as well, right? You don't want the consumer to feel like they're buying a product that is so stripped down and basic because of the regulatory factors. But when you're trying to do that across multiple markets, it gets very complex very quickly. The amount of different regulatory that needs to be put on in each state can drive you wild. I will always think that we have too many packaging SKUs, but marketing may argue with me.
Yeah, the other challenge out there too, so we've been trying to do more stuff domestically, but one of the real challenges on the packaging in particular, at least in California, is the regulations demand all kinds of silly things, right? Child resistant packaging, tamper evident seals, really makes it hard to be environmentally friendly and sustainable with recyclable and compostable stuff. And it's really, has the public policy makes no sense, right? You have a liquor store with one guy in the back, nothing has child resistant packaging on it. if a kid drinks that bottle of vodka, they die, like literally die. On the other hand, in a cannabis dispensary, you got to check ID, you got 3 security guards, everything's in child resistant packaging, tamper evident seals. If a kid eats an eighth of cannabis, they're not even going to get high, right? I mean, they might get a stomach ache, but nobody's dying, right? So this kind of swing to the side of the devil's lettuce that we're so afraid of has real environmental impacts and cost impacts, to consumers, and I don't think actually accomplishes anything. So one of the things that we're pushing on is to try and get people to be a little bit more sensible on the regulatory side with the packaging, so that we can be smarter about reducing costs to consumers and being more sustainable, recyclable, reusable, compostable, et cetera, with the packaging options that are available.
Ben, I think what we've been doing on our end is we're actually been making a large push towards dynamic printing, to ensure that we can minimize some of the labeling and the experience. I think the reality is that I think across the country there is substantially different regulations, and yet we are, as Jed was commenting, I mean, we're attempting to be able to ensure that our packaging is somewhat universal, and then through some form of dynamic printing that we can minimize the amount of additional labels and requirements, and ending a more pleasant user experience once receiving it, and trying to dig through the amount of different labels that are covering up one another anyway. And so we're making a big push on that side.
Absolutely. Well, very excited to pick up this thread along with much more out at Cannabis Conference 2022 later this year. Again, this is a fairly complicated issue, but I think this was a really great conversation over the past hour, and along with all sorts of other topics. Very eager to pick it back up in Las Vegas in August. Check out cannabisconference.com. We will be dropping the educational schedule this week, so look out for that, for all the topics we'll be covering. I want to thank everybody in the audience, of course, for attending today, and absolutely want to thank Jed, Ryan, and Graham for your time and your insight. This was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you.